in our Slack channel, which is like where we share everything. I'll share this at the end as well, so if you miss it now, don't worry about it. This event is hosted by our caucus chairs since minorities are disproportionately affected by domestic violence. If you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourself, we can start with the Hispanic caucus chair.
I guess I'll go first. Hi guys, I am one of the chairs because there's another one, and my name is Sophia Blanco. I'm a freshman and I major in political science, and I'll give it to my caucus co-chair.
Hi guys, I am the other co-chair of the Hispanic Caucus. My name is Isabella. My pronouns are she, her. I am a freshman and I am studying biomedical sciences.
Hi guys, I'm Ashley. I am the co-chair for the Women's Caucus. I'm a senior majoring in political science. I'm not sure if Olivia's here.
We can just jump to Jalen. If Olivia comes in later, she can introduce herself.
All right. Hey everyone. My name is Jalen. Jalen Grant. I'm the Black Caucus chair, and I'm majoring in psychology, and I'm really excited to do this event with everybody.
Hey everybody. I'm Logan. I'm the chair of the LGBTQ Caucus. I'm a sophomore majoring in political science, and this event is very meaningful, and I'm glad you all are here. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you so much. And now our guest speaker, Emily from Women in Distress, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you all for having me. It's great to be with you. My name is Emily Janis. I'm the Education and Prevention Manager at Women in Distress, which is one of the certified domestic violence centers throughout the state of Florida. Florida actually has some of the strongest domestic violence public policy in the country, which is surprising given the rest of what our state looks like. But there are certified centers throughout the state, including in Orange County and elsewhere. So we're the ones serving Broward, but a lot of the services and stuff that we do, folks do all over the country or all over the state. So I don't know if there was any other business or if you want me to jump right into it.
No, I just stopped screen sharing, so hopefully you should be able to share now.
Yeah. So I do these presentations a lot as part of my role, and I talk to a lot of like professionals, college students, and folks. So I do have sort of a PowerPoint to guide our conversation. I don't want it to feel super lecture-y because I know y'all are in classes because you're students. So feel free to, and we're a small enough group, so feel free to interrupt me or unmute. I'm going to ask you to use the chat a little bit too, but all of that is fine. This is really an event for y'all to learn, and I was really excited to get the outreach. A lot of the times when I work with college students in particular, it's because their professors are reaching out to me. So it's neat to be able to talk with y'all in like a student-led group. So we're going to go over domestic violence today, which can be a tricky topic. We're not going to talk explicitly about incidents of violence, but I know, and we'll talk about some statistics, that this can be a personal experience for some folks. So feel free to, turn off your camera, walk away, take deep breaths, do whatever you need to do in the space. But we won't go too much into like the nitty gritty. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the dynamics, and especially because we have all these caucuses represented, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality in DV as well, because even though we know anyone can go through it, it still looks different depending on who you are, right? And what access to resources that you have. And we don't want to ignore that part of the conversation. So our mission at Women in Distress is to stop domestic violence for everyone through intervention, education, and advocacy. And the reason I like to mention this up at the top is that first part of the mission, right? To stop domestic abuse. For us to do this work and for us to be allies to survivors and for us to show up and even listen to this, we have to first believe that violence is preventable. And domestic violence, relationship violence is preventable. It's a learned behavior. It's an intentional behavior. This isn't, a private issue. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence is really becoming, as it should be, a public health and a public safety issue. And so part of that is really seeing it as a community-wide problem, right? Even if we're not personally affected in our own relationships or in those relationships of folks around us, it's making our community less safe that this violence exists. So, I want to kind of just lay that out at the beginning so we can think about it that way, because it is tough to talk about some of the statistics and things, we will, but part of understanding those is being able to move forward and change our communities. We have violence-free futures. So we're going to do a little true and false. Again, you can unmute, or the easiest way I found to do this doing Zooms is just use the chat and let me know what you think. It's optional. You participate as much as you feel comfortable. But we're going to do the first one. True or false, most people end a relationship if it becomes abusive. What do we think? All right, yeah, y'all are good. I see lots of falses here. This is exactly right. I get this question a whole lot when I'm in the community where folks, I'll give like my little elevator pitch spiel, and they'll say, okay, I get it, it's bad, violence is bad, but then why are people staying in these relationships? What's wrong with them? Why do they keep dating these people? Why do they keep getting into this? The reality is it is very hard and very complicated to leave an abusive relationship, especially because domestic violence is all about power and control. It's about one person in a relationship not having that power and that control. And when you don't have that power, it's very difficult to leave. So this one is false. On average, a survivor will leave an abusive relationship 7 times before she leaves for good, which think about what that means with us showing up in community with others, right? If we might have a friend or, family member or someone we care about who is in an abusive situation, whether that's emotional, physical, financial, whatever, and we might do everything for them that first time. And we show up and we, let them use our phone to call a hotline. We let them sleep on our couch. We talk to them. We're like, text me, whatever. Are we going to do that the 6th and the 7th and possibly the 8th time? Well, we should, right? Because again, we're going to see this pattern. If this is the average, we know that we got to be patient with folks and understand really that when somebody returns to an abusive relationship, they're not asking to be abused again. It's still the abuser's choice every single time to continue abusing this person, right? And we have to really think about it like that. They are the source of violence in the relationship, not the survivor. All right. True or false? Most men who abuse their partner grew up in violent homes. What do we think? Okay, I see some trues. I appreciate y'all's participation. Yeah, I'm very impressed too. A lot of adults get this one wrong, or like professionals, because they overthink it. This is true, right? Observing intimate partner violence in childhood increases the risk of later perpetration for men by an estimated 56 or 63%, depending on severity. So, we'll talk about that. This is still, this is an issue that anyone can go through, but it is still primarily a violence against women issue perpetrated by men. And that is not accidental. That's due to historical oppression and different gender stereotypes and all of these things. So especially with this trend, we can see that men and boys who grow up in violent homes are more likely to take on the behaviors and the norms of the abusive parent, who is usually the male parent in a heterosexual household. So we can see this trend, right? But again, we say violence is preventable, right? So this is one of the risk factors, but it's definitely most and not all. It's not set in stone that they're going to become abusers or become victims, but we want to see these trends because we learn about relationships from a lot of different places, right? We learn about them obviously from the adults in our home, but it could be from our friends, our school, social media, our ideologies, our groups. So we got to understand there's lots of influences. This is just a primary one. All right. Alcohol and drug use and anger management issues are both major causes of DV. What do we think? Okay, I'm seeing some more trues. Oh, y'all were doing so great. I was gonna give you 100% a perfect score, but this one is false. And I kind of hinted at it earlier, but I know it's tough to catch on. It is not about alcohol and drug use, and it's not about anger management. These aren't really even super big contributing factors to DV. Alcohol and drug use in particular can sometimes increase the severity or the frequency of individual violent incidents, but domestic violence in relationships is all about unequal power and control. It's about that ongoing dynamic. It has nothing to do with that drug abuse, but that's often an excuse, right? We hear from abusers where they're like, well, I just have a substance abuse issue, I have a drinking problem, I have a drug addiction. And I need you to help me get through that. I don't have a violence issue. And they can co-occur, but even when they co-occur, they need to be treated as independent problems. Same thing with anger management. One of the best ways to kind of remember that piece is someone with true anger management issues often can't decide who those anger management issues impact. So they might have trouble with their classmates, with their boss at work, with their neighbors, whereas abusers are often only directing their violence intentionally towards their partner and their partner's children, possibly. And you know, they're often very smooth and charismatic and amazing in front of other people. So it's very deliberate. All right, last one I have, and then I'll let you stop playing this game with me. Victims of abuse often feel embarrassed, ashamed, and feel that the abuse is their fault. So please ignore my typo on the screen. I'm seeing it now. Yeah, true. Okay, so we know this, right? And this is where I sort of want y'all's feelings about this. If I'm up here saying it's not their fault, you know, this is a social problem, it's not individual to them, it's a learned behavior, it's preventable, then why do survivors feel this way? Where is that feeling of shame and embarrassment and like it's their fault? Where does that come from, do you think? Feel free to share in the chat or unmute if you like. Yeah, societal pressures. Thank you, Hannah. The other person takes away their power. Yeah, the big one with society is, again, we don't talk about domestic violence. A lot of the times when I do this sort of stuff in the community, it's the one time folks are learning about it or hearing about it. And if we treat it as sort of this untouchable issue, or if we just don't know enough to support survivors, we can end up having really, you know, bad consequences. And yeah, a lot of it's the abuser themselves saying, this is your fault. You're a bad partner. You're a bad mother. You're a bad husband. You're a bad friend. You know, no one else is ever going to love you. No one else is ever going to treat you the way I treat you. You're lucky that I'm with you. And we might hear that as sort of an example and be like, I would never believe that, whatever, but it's much harder when you're in it. So yeah, the abuser themselves. Thank y'all for your thoughts. And I kind of wanted to dive into that a little just because when we do confront survivors in our lives and we have a friend or a family member who's going through this, it's important to know that even when they get the courage to come to you about it, they're still carrying all of that around, and they're probably going to be carrying that around for a really long time. You know, we have therapists here that work with folks, but it takes a while to work through those things and might even take forever. So we want to be patient and empathetic. So DV, like I mentioned earlier, it can happen to anyone. It's not unique to any one community or any one group. A lot of the times, you know, we think of the word victim or survivor. We often think of a woman. She's probably a little on the younger side. She's probably white. She might have a black eye and think it's a black and white poster and she's like, shh, and all this stuff. That's not always what domestic violence looks like. And we want to make sure that we're opening ourselves up to seeing the red flags, to seeing these types of abuse with anyone in our lives. It's not unique, you know. Same thing with education level and socioeconomic status. No sort of level you can reach an achievement that's going to protect you necessarily. What's going to protect us is if we start holding abusers accountable and change the social norms that allow abuse to happen. So how many people are affected? Let's talk about the statistics here. These are a little astounding, probably even more than a little. So 1 in 3 women will experience some form of intimate partner violence in her lifetime worldwide. Even before the pandemic started, I used to say if this were like a physical disease, this is all we'd be talking about. Our world would stop, we would have vaccines, we would do all this stuff because of how just large of an issue this is. But because we treat it as an emotional issue, as something the victim is contributing to, as this private issue, we're not treating it the same way. The other thing about this statistic and the other ones I'm going to show you is they're all underestimates because we got to get this data from somewhere, right? So, you know, we're not getting every single case of domestic violence across our desks, especially worldwide, where a lot of folks around the world don't have access to domestic violence shelters. They don't have laws like the Violence Against Women Act, which is up for reauthorization. They don't have all of these different resources. And so we're not getting those reports. In the US, even with all that stuff, we're still not doing much better. So 1 in 4 women will experience some form of intimate partner violence in her lifetime in the US. That's a quarter of all people that identify as women, which again, is astounding, right? For how just the large scope of this. For men, the statistic that we have is 1 in 10. This one is definitely an underreport because just as much as we know that women underreport domestic violence to hotlines, to law enforcement agencies for all sorts of reasons, we know that men are even more likely to not report because of that stigma around their experience and around their gender identity and around what their expectations of them are and just what the expectations of them are in relationships. Zooming in even closer to Florida, we're actually doing slightly worse than the national average, which again, we have all of this infrastructure in the state of Florida, right? 34.2% of Florida women will experience intimate partner dating violence, stalking, or sexual violence in their lifetimes. For men, same thing. We're at about a quarter, which is, at least we're seeing more reporting, but that's, again, a really, really astounding number for us. For LGBTQ folks, unfortunately, we don't have that much hard data. I have a little bit more later in the presentation when we start talking about intersectionality a bit more, but for LGBTQ folks in general, we know that it happens at least the same and most likely elevated rates as their non-LGBTQ peers. So just like LGBTQ folks are at greater risk of different forms of violence, we see that here as well. Again, think about, why don't we have hard data on this, do you think? Why can't I give you like a 1 out of 4 number? What do you think? I'm trying to pull up my chat here. I feel like, here we go. Yeah, far less reported. They're more ashamed. Yeah, for sure. And even when they report, they might not identify themselves as part of the LGBTQ community. Our name is Women in Distress. So we get folks that call our hotline who might, even though we are LGBTQ friendly and affirming, if we don't show that and they're really open and like pushing that, folks might call our hotline and lie about the gender of their partner on the call, or they might lie about their own identity or their own preferred name just because they want to get in the door and they want to get services, right? But that has to get documented. So we might document it incorrectly and then lose that data point. So there's a lot of that happening. And then especially with law enforcement, which is another major way we get these statistics, I've seen stories of law enforcement officers showing up, two partners who identify as the same gender, and they'll list them as roommates, which is like, okay, thanks for helping. 1 in 2 female murder victims and 1 in 13 male murder victims are killed by their intimate partners. This sort of gets to the urgency of the issue. And when I say it's a public safety issue, it's a life or death issue, right? So we know that firearms and strangulation are the 2 leading causes of death for folks that die because of or killed by their intimate partners. But it's happening, again, a lot, and this can easily lead to high lethality cases. So we want to make sure we look for those indicators and ask the questions, and again, start changing the social norms that lead to statistics like this. For children, more than 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence each year in the household, and that kind of goes back to that generational cycle, but children can also be affected in the immediate, right? Which is why I like to give that sort of warning at the beginning of this presentation, or just that heads up, because even if you haven't personally experienced relationship violence, you or someone you know may have grown up in a home with it. And even though you might be safe or feel that sense of safety, it doesn't mean you weren't affected by what happened. And folks have different resiliencies, but we want to understand that it affects the entire household and the entire community, and not just the 2 people in the relationship. For teens as well, and this is between the ages of 12 and 18, 1 in 3 teens will experience dating violence in the US, which far exceeds rates of other types of youth violence. But out of those 1 in 3, only 33% tell anyone in their personal lives. And, honestly, they're not telling their parents, especially if they're LGBTQ. They're not allowed to date. They're not telling their teachers or a trusted adult. They're telling their friends, right? So we have to talk really openly, and a lot of our education work even is just focused on working with high school students and middle school students to start talking about healthy relationships, right? Maybe even more than the warning signs, because it's great to give you the warning signs and know what not to do and what to look out for, but you have to replace that with something too, right? And that's often where we see the most progress with young people is, well, let's just talk about what's healthy and really stick to that, because then you have that tool and you know what doesn't match that. We also know that LGBTQ teens are just as likely to experience abuse, but that are less likely to report it and to get help, especially if they're in a school or community environment where there's like a tight-knit group of LGBTQ folks. Maybe it's an unaffirming place and they found a GSA club or something. They're most likely dating in that situation someone who's also in that support group and that social system. And so by trying to leave their abusive partner, they might be leaving behind their support system. And you also can't talk about the relationship abuse without talking about your identity in that case. So this has real ramifications. I promise there's not too many more statistics. I don't want to hammer down the numbers too much, but I think it's important with the scope. Luckily the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did name intimate partner violence as a public health issue, which is the direction we want to go with it. But we're still spending a whole lot of money. So up to $12.6 billion is the estimated cost of IPV each year. I'm sure like you all, I could also, think of many better ways to spend that money. And that's even partially, that's our jobs at Women in Distress. That's certified domestic violence centers. That's extra courts that needed to be established to handle the domestic violence cases. Like Broward County, where I'm in, has a separate domestic violence court. I believe Orange County does too. This is law enforcement costs. This is child welfare system costs. It's medical costs for survivors that are showing up in ERs and in hospitals and are having long-term health effects. So there's a lot that we're spending here that we could reallocate when we prevent this form of violence. We also know that 8 million days of paid work are lost to victims of DV each year. That's the equivalent of 32,000 full-time jobs. And we know that 57% of homeless families are attributed to DV. That's one of the major reasons why folks don't leave abusive relationships is they're choosing between homelessness and staying with their partner. And we know as well, I mean, Orange County, just like South Florida, if any of you are from here, affordable housing is very unavailable, and that's true around the country. So a survivor who's already being controlled financially and emotionally and physically and verbally, then trying to leave with her kids, she's not going to be able to find an affordable, safe place to stay long-term, right? And that's where emergency services kind of can come in and intervene. But that just social economic issue in our communities is directly impacting survivors. So what do we talk about when we talk about IPV? I'm going to just briefly go over the legal definition. This is not the definition that we apply at domestic violence centers, but this is the definition that you'll confront if you call law enforcement or if you show up to the court system and try to get an injunction or a restraining order. So DV per Florida state statute is any of these behaviors or any criminal offense resulting in physical injury or death, one family or household member by another family or household member. So 2 things about this. One is the family or household member, right? So this domestic means home. This doesn't just mean intimate partners. And that's better. We want more expansive definitions of these things. What's a problem is that any criminal offense resulting in physical injury or death, right? You have to be physically injured or dead or in immediate and imminent danger of being physically injured or dead for this to apply. And think of all that misses. The emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, the financial abuse, the manipulation, the gaslighting, everything else that's wrapped up into a domestic violence situation. And we know that not every domestic violence relationship has aspects of physical abuse. Sometimes it doesn't escalate into that. Doesn't mean it's any less harmful or any less bad. So this is the definition that I hope you take with you, and really start applying and seeing it as. So we see it as an intentional pattern of abusive behaviors through the use of power and control tactics used by one person over another in an intimate relationship, right? And so that then includes all of these other ways that abusers try to perpetuate control and power over their victim, right? Through emotional abuse, verbal abuse, all of that. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the power and control wheel. This is a great kind of model to sort of think about it with that way. And if you ever are, working or, kind of set up your space for wherever you are, if you hang one of these or even hang like a little purple ribbon, that can be a good silent signal for survivors that you know about domestic violence at least a little bit, you're a supporter, and you know that it's not just physical and it's not just this definition, right? So these are some of the types, right? Emotional and verbal are some of the most common, and that's where we often kind of move from an unhealthy to an abusive relationship. The biggest difference between an unhealthy relationship and an abusive one is the presence of fear. And that could be fear for your physical safety, but it can also be fear for your emotional safety, for your mental safety, for your psychological safety, for your financial safety, right? Whereas unhealthy, you're just feeling uncomfortable. And maybe your boundaries are getting pushed, they're not completely being crossed, but you're made to feel sort of guilty about having those boundaries. You're being frustrated, you're fighting a lot with your partner. It's starting to become a little one-sided, right? But when something crosses over to abuse, it's not that somebody hit you or a violent incident happened, it's that you start feeling scared, right? You start to have that presence of fear, and that can happen no matter what the other person does in terms of physical violence or not. So these are some of the most common tactics, especially the minimizing, denying, and blaming. Does everyone know what gaslighting is? I don't want to use that term if we're not familiar. Okay. For those of you with your video on, I see you shaking your head, so I appreciate that. But that's a really big one that we see, just making someone question their sense of reality, making them unsure of themselves, really wearing down at their self-esteem, their sense of who they are, right? So then why don't survivors leave, right? If all this stuff is going on, what's happening? The number one reason really is fear and safety. And fear and safety can look different for different folks. This is where intersectionality really starts to pop up, right? But your sense of safety in the world and your sense of safety in your relationship are some of the most important things that drive our decision making. And so when your partner is threatening, if you leave me, I'm going to hurt myself. If you leave me, I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to, take the kids. I'm going to, start all these rumors about you. I'm going to, whatever it is, whatever that blackmail threat is, that fear is real, right? And you might even think they're bluffing, but it's a really hard decision to make. The most dangerous time for a survivor is when they're leaving an abusive relationship, because then the abuser loses that control over them and is going to try to do the more extreme things to get it back. Social pressures, like we talked about earlier, right? You guys are so good together. They're just going through a rough time, not understanding that difference of, okay, things are maybe unhealthy and we can work it out, versus once you get to that abusive territory, one partner wants it to be that way, right? This is also why couples counseling does not work for domestic violence survivors, because one partner actively wants that situation and the other one doesn't, right? So there's no kind of like compromise and working out that way. Religious and cultural beliefs and love. I always make sure to point out that one, because that's the one we're like kind of tiptoeing and we start to almost get to victim blaming. This is not some stranger that walked into your life and suddenly started abusing you. This is someone at one point you chose to be in a relationship with, and it wasn't abusive on the first date, right? So we have to be patient with folks and not validate that what's happening to them is loving. We can validate that they deserve love and they deserve respect and they deserve safety, and also say, and I get that this is a really hard thing. You're tearing this relationship down. This is something that was really important to you, that is a big part of your life. That emotional loss can still be a loss, even if they weren't being treated right. So we want to validate that feeling for them without validating that what happened to them is okay. It absolutely wasn't. So let's talk about what this looks like, because one of the biggest ways intersectionality and our identities show up in domestic violence relationships is these barriers to services, right? So again, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat, but kind of knowing a little bit about that and what we just talked about, what are some ways that a survivor's identity might impact their ability to leave an abusive relationship and receive support of survivors? If we have a survivor of color, if we have a survivor with disabilities, if we have a survivor who has limited English proficiency as part of the LGBTQ community, how is it going to make it even harder outside of just these primary reasons? What do y'all think? So again, feel free to unmute or you can toss that in the chat. Yeah, being low income, definitely. Again, we talked about that with even affordable housing, getting access to transportation, being able to keep a job, all of that. That can really affect your ability to leave, especially if you're living with a partner. Okay. Some of the big ones that I kind of mentioned show up as well. So we know that, folks with higher rates of poverty, if you have poor education or limited job resources, that's sort of what was said with the being low income. Language barriers, we do have advocates that speak Spanish, Portuguese, Creole, but even then folks can feel like they're asking for too much to ask for an advocate that speaks for that, or they just don't know if we have folks that can speak in their primary language. Even if they speak English, they might feel this is already a vulnerable, hard thing to talk about. So we want to make sure folks can talk about it in the language and in the space that they're most comfortable. Not having a family or support system to lean on outside. Fear of identity being outed in a non-accepting community. Yep, y'all are doing great. Especially that family one. Sometimes when we come from an identity, like a minority identity or just a culture that really values family and really values that togetherness and us sacrificing our individuality for the good of the family, can be really harmful when it comes to domestic violence, right? Because in that situation, family is what's hurting, and that's not true love, that's not family, that's not a supportive environment. And so by leaving, you're now turning your back on this cultural norm that you're supposed to be upholding. And yeah, the fear of being outed is huge in LGBTQ folks, especially when we talk about LGBTQ young people, right? Especially if there's a danger of their parents finding out about their identity or being outed to them. That's something the abuser can say is, well, if you leave me, I'm going to tell your parents that, you identify this way. Fear of deportation, especially for folks, immigrants. And, we're completely confidential. We have victim advocate privilege in the same way that folks have attorney-client privilege. but not all survivors know that. So, you know, they don't know if we're law enforcement, they don't know if we're the government, if we're gonna have to call ICE or call someone on them, or are they gonna lose their immigration status if they leave their partner, right? And that's how they got their status here. So there's a lot of stuff wrapped up. There could be distrust of law enforcement, particularly in communities of color and LGBTQ communities. And there's a skepticism and distrust of shelter and intervention services, right? Are you going to be able to support me? Are you going to listen to me? Are your advocates trained to know what I'm going through, right? Do I belong here? Is this going to be too, you know, narrow focused? And, you know, we do a lot of trainings for our staff and with our staff around these issues because we want any survivor to feel comfortable here, right? We want to work on the domestic violence issue. We don't want it to be an issue of who you are or what you need. And so here are some kind of a little bit more alarming statistics. So again, like I said, you know, it can happen in any community, but we know that certain folks are more at risk and it can look different. The experience of the violence and experience of accessing services can look different based on your identity. So particularly for African-American women, I used African-American because the source I pulled this from used that term. I know a lot of folks might prefer other terms, but that's why that's on there. African-American women experience intimate partner violence at a rate 35% higher than that of white women and about 2.5 times the rate of women of other races. They're experiencing it more, but they are less likely, particularly than white women, to access services, and they experience higher rates of IPV homicide. So not only are they experiencing more abusive relationships, they're less likely to get the service, and those relationships are more likely to become fatal or have a high lethality indicator. For the LGBTQ community, gay and bisexual men experience IPV in relationships at the same rate as heterosexual women. About 50% of lesbian women will experience IPV, which again, astounding. You have half of a group who's going to be experiencing it. And then according to the 2015 US Transgender Survey, which is the most updated information we have available, 54% of transgender and non-binary folks experienced in that survey some form of intimate partner violence. For sexual assault, that's a huge heightened risk factor. 47% of respondents were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. That shouldn't say 100%, it should say 10% within the last year. And for Black respondents or folks that identified as Black in this survey, it was 53 and 13%. 53%. That is unacceptable and astounding. So again, even though we know anyone can experience it and it's bad when anyone does, we have to see how folks' identities can cut them off from resources or create even more harmful norms and more barriers to services. So we have to do even more and really practice a lot of equity to make our services and just our communities, more accessible for all of these folks. And this kind of gets us to why DV even occurs, right? We can't ignore those historical forms of oppression that have affected it. And domestic violence is itself a form of oppression, right? When you zoom in on that power and control model, and then you zoom back out, it's that same model that's being applied no matter who's oppressing who, right? It's this one group who maintains the power and control, makes the other one feel like they have no options, gaslights the other one, right? And that can happen on a macro all the way down to a micro scale. But when one form of oppression exists, it validates all other forms of oppression. So to do this anti-violence work and to do all the work that I think y'all are doing since you showed up here tonight, we have to see it as fighting all forms of oppression and not just single issue stuff, right? For us to truly prevent and fight and do our mission of stop domestic abuse, we also then have to be anti-racist and anti-sexist and, all of these other different things. And then we know a lot of this comes down to as well, those unrealistic relationship expectations. So these are the causes. It's not, again, the, drugs or alcohol, it's not the anger management. We see these systemic embedded causes that are perpetuated, right? And we can change these things and we can recognize those histories of oppression and work to dismantle them, but that takes a lot of work and a lot of coordinated effort. Because I'll tell you, part of the first step is shifting the accountability onto the person who's causing the violence, right? Like I said, I always get that question, well, why do survivors stay, right? Why are people staying in these abusive relationships? I almost never get the question, well, why do they abuse? Why are they choosing to bring violence into this home, into this relationship? right? We shift so much of the accountability, and this is true for sexual assault as well and sexual violence. We put so much on, well, what is she doing? What is she doing to protect her kids? What are they doing to leave? What is he doing to save money? Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why don't you just leave? Instead of saying, well, why do they keep treating you badly? Why do they over and over again keep perpetuating violence towards you? And what makes that okay? And the easy answer is because they can and because it works, right? If you feel entitled to that power and control and that role in that relationship, and you start implementing these tactics, you're probably going to get the power and control, right? And if the victim doesn't have that autonomy or that power to stop you, and us as a community aren't holding you accountable, then it's going to keep going. So, and again, learned behavior, societal reinforcement. So we want to understand abuse is never the victim's fault, even when she chooses to go back, even when someone stays with that person, never the victim's fault. So the red flags, just so y'all can start seeing these things, and hopefully not really, hopefully you don't see it, but if you do, frequent criticizing and frequent injuries, gaslighting, threats, if you ever leave me, possessive jealousy is a real big one. So jealousy is a normal human emotion. We feel it all the time. I grew up as the middle child. I don't think I got enough attention as a kid, which is why I public speak for a living. That's normal. What's not normal is using that emotion that you can't choose to feel as an excuse to control or hold power over someone else, right? That's where it has to stop. You can deal with jealousy in a healthy way, in a productive way, and see it for the kind of signal it is to your brain about what's happening. It could be good, bad, whatever else. It could mean a lot of different things. What you can't do is put that onto someone else and say, well, I'm jealous, so I need your phone password. You need to tell me where you're going. I need your location, et cetera, et cetera. If someone's constantly blaming other people for their problems and not taking accountability for anything, when things go right or things go wrong, they're constantly checking up, constant contact, isolation from family and friends is one of the biggest. If you start feeling guilty for being around friends and family or doing things that you enjoy that you don't necessarily share with your partner, you're allowed to have those things. You're still your own person. No one should make you feel bad or guilty for those things. As long as it's within the boundaries of your relationship. And same thing with boundary pushing and coercion. They might not cross your boundaries right away, but they're going to make you feel a little guilty, or they're going to say, well, come on, but we've been together for a while and all of this stuff. None of that is okay. Anytime you're moving your boundaries, it should be because you absolutely want to. Anytime you consent to something, it should be because you absolutely want to, not because you feel frustrated or pressured or guilted or scared. So what can you do other than this time together tonight? One thing is recognize your role as a bystander. That's that whole because they can and because it works. We can change that. Recognize your own power and the communal responsibility for us to take steps really in making a situation better or less destructive. We don't want to see ourselves, we don't even see ourselves like this at WID, of swooping in and saving anyone. We can't do that, but we got to listen first. We got to hear their barriers, hear what's going on, and then show up for them and say, well, what can I help you with? I can't make it all go away. I can't make it all better, but what can I do for you to help? And then hold abusers accountable, because just as much as we might have someone in our life who's a survivor, we might have a friend or family member who's doing some of those abusive things or those red flag kind of level things. So how do we use our power in their life and our influence to say, hey, you should delete that picture. Why do you talk to her like that? Why did you say that to them? How can we show up and hold that abuser accountable and send that message? Empower others to do the same. Encourage a victim to talk, but don't force them. Let them know there are resources. Let them know it's not their fault. Help them get to that resource, but just be that ongoing presence for them. And avoid victim blaming. We know this, but again, we really want to hold on to that idea. It's never the victim's fault, and really recognize victim blaming as sort of what it is, which is often a way to separate ourselves, right? If I say, well, that only happened to her because she was drinking, that only happened to him because he didn't see the warning signs, whatever else you can think of, I'm kind of telling myself, well, I would never do that. I would know the warning signs. I wouldn't go out and do that. When the reality is, it could happen anyway, because it really isn't my fault if it happens to me, right? And we want to use non-passive language. A lot of the times when you see domestic violence headlines or stuff talked about, it's like, woman shot, Mary was beat, right? Instead of, this person chose to do this thing to this other person, right? Man fatally shoots woman. We should be talking about it in that way that centers the abuser's action rather than the victim's experience of it. And it's not to say we don't want to hear about victim experience, but in terms of highlighting this thing happened, we want to highlight this is the person that chose to do this, not I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, I didn't do enough to protect myself, whatever else. There's a great video from Jackson Katz about that. And then educate yourself. This is really like a surface level, kind of like scraping the top of the surface, you know, when we talk about gender-based violence and forms of intimate partner violence and relationship violence. So, you know, learn more. There's a lot of great stuff on social media. Just make sure you check your sources. There's a lot of great stuff about healthy relationships, about consent. This is true. You can apply a lot of this stuff in friendships as well, not just romantic relationships. So, you know, really do the work and then talk to other people about it. Because awareness plus action is social change, right? This is the first step, is learning the issues, learning what's going on, listening to survivors, listening to folks' experiences, and then we got to do something with it. Because if we don't, nothing's ever going to change, right? We got to take that step, and that's where we'll start to see social change. And then I just want to leave you with some resources. So this is our number here. We are in Broward County, but even if you call us, we can try to connect you with a center that's closer to you. Same thing with 211. Most counties in the state of Florida have a 211, and that's a great way if someone doesn't feel safe to take like a printed piece of paper, write something down or save it in their phone. They can call 211 and get routed to a local hotline or a national or statewide hotline. And then Love is Respect. The reason I really love them is because they have an online chat and a text line. So if you feel more comfortable not speaking on the phone, or it's just a safety issue to be verbally talking about this, that's a really great resource there. And then again, you have the Florida statewide hotline as well as the national hotline. And then when accessing resources, something you can tell folks is, you know, one of the best things you can do for a survivor who's maybe looking to call a hotline, offer your phone if that feels safer. Because a lot of times abusers will check their partner's phone or check the phone bill or something like that. So if you feel comfortable, have that happen. You can have them save or bookmark resources with their names. And most domestic violence websites have an escape button that'll, instead of like sketchily closing out the browser, it'll just bring up a neutral page, like ours brings up the Weather Channel. So if someone's like nervous about, maybe they're in like the school library or they're working from home or they're just afraid someone else is gonna see, that can be a quick safety measure that can help them feel a little more comfortable accessing the resource. And then again, here's our crisis line, our website, and our Florida Domestic Violence Hotline. There's some sources. I'm happy to send this to you if you're interested, if you want to read more. There's some, as I said, there's a lot of great stuff out there with a lot of, and you can kind of dive into different rabbit holes with this subject. And that's it. So I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions. I know I did sort of talk at you most of the time, but hopefully it was helpful. And then we do, if you want to provide some feedback, we're all grant funded, so all of our services are free. So they like to hear that we're talking to real people in community. So if you would like to fill out our survey, you can pull it up on your phone, and I'll also drop the link in the chat. But I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions if you have them.
If anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to ask them, or you can put it in the chat also.
I'm also going to drop my email in the chat. If you have a question that you don't feel comfortable asking out loud or in this group, feel free to email me as well, and I'm happy to follow up with you. Well, thank you again so much for having me. I know you guys are.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh my gosh, I see it. I'm so sorry. My chat keeps going away. My bad. You can tell that
Ashley, were you able to unmute yourself, or do you want to type it? Oh, she typed it.
Okay, perfect. All right, I do see this question about the stats for Hispanic women. There are. I didn't have enough room to put it on, and that's very important. If you go to, I'll separately send it. This Women of Color Network Facts Domestic Violence. It's from 2006, but they did a really in-depth survey of different women from different racial communities and ethnic communities and cultural backgrounds. And they were able to take a lot of great statistics and just stories from that as well. So that's an awesome PDF to sort of read. So I'd send you there for that. All right. Are there specific resources for higher risk individuals experiencing DV like migrant women and trans women? Yes. So we work really closely with the local LGBTQ service centers and some of the local immigration service centers that are here that support folks in those communities to kind of connect them. As far as I know, locally in Broward, there isn't like a specific shelter or domestic violence center for those groups, but that's sort of where that partnership comes in. And then I know we also work really closely with legal aid to be able to provide help with U visas and T visas, which are programs that were established through the Violence Against Women Act to grant specific immigration status to folks who are survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence. How can one presenter offer help and resources to someone they know is an abusive relationship across the spectrum? Yep. So in the state of Florida, which is great, every center will serve everybody. So it doesn't matter if whatever your gender identity is, if you're, woman identifying, male identifying, non-binary, anything in between, you can get services at that center. The best way to do it is really start asking questions. So you don't really want to go out with the gate and be like, hey, I think you're in an abusive relationship, call this hotline, because that's going to make them really defensive and scared. The best thing to do is start asking about the relationship. Hey, you've seemed really off. And note some of the red flags, note some specific behaviors. I feel like I never see you anymore. Every time you're with me, you're texting them. Does that feel okay for you? Like I'm a little worried about you, and here's these very specific things why. It's up to us to ask the questions instead of waiting for them to come to us. And most likely they're gonna be like, everything's fine. Or thanks for asking. No, it's all good. I've got it. Everything's good. And that's when you want to leave the door wide open and say, well, listen, if anything comes up, like you can come to me, I care about you, right? And that way, when they are ready to disclose and come to someone, they have someone in their corner. We talked about the social pressures and that kind of shame and embarrassment. At least in that situation, they know they have someone. And then when they are ready, or if they do disclose when you ask them, that's where you can say, I always say, blame it on me. I listened to this presentation. I heard about this. I saw this on social media, whatever. There's a hotline. Do you want me to call? Do you want me to call on speaker so you can see what it's like? Is there anything I could do to make it easier? Do you want to wait on it and just keep it? Like just walk them through and be very patient, right? Their safety is the most important thing. So you don't want to push them in any one direction, but just speak from your experience, right? Tell them how you feel, tell them that you're worried and that you care about them and that they deserve love and it is not their fault. I hope that wasn't too general of an answer and that helps. It's very hard. It's much easier to say than to do, but that's what's going to change things is for us to ask those questions when we see those things.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm one of the Women's Caucus chairs. I wasn't able to introduce myself before because my Wi-Fi wasn't working, but I wanted to ask, especially during the pandemic when more people are having to stay home or stuck in a situation where they're stuck with the abuser, what's a way that we can help them or resources we could give them without them having to reveal to, you know what I'm saying? Because of the pandemic downs and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. That's why the text line and the chat line and some local centers, I'm not sure if the one in Orange County does, their own hotline is a text line. That's often the safest way for folks that are stuck at home during a pandemic because you don't have to pick up a phone and call, right? You can kind of text and then you can even delete the chat. With the online chat too, it disappears after you're done, just like when you go on any website and you chat tech support or whatever. So that's usually the safest avenue for folks to start getting help. And then that's where you as friends can make excuses or try to get them out of the house. Another really good thing is code words. So if they feel safe setting up a code word with them or with anyone that they trust, where if they text that to you or just get that code word to you somehow, you do something that you've agreed on. So that code word, if you get that code word, it might mean you call 911. If you get that code word, it might be, hey, call me and make an excuse to talk to me. Or it might be, hey, knock on my door and bring me some food or something, right? But you can have that thing planned so that when they need that help, even if it's just they need to talk to someone, but they don't feel comfortable saying it, you have that. But yeah, those text lines and those chat lines are often the best way for folks in a pandemic circumstance to reach out for help for the first time.
Are there any more questions? All right, well, thank you so much for coming, Emily. Thank you so much for what you do. You know, this is so important. My mom is here. She also works at Women in Distress, but both of you are so important. So thank you guys so much for sharing your knowledge and all your resources, and also accommodating to Orange County while being in Broward. We appreciate that so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having. I'm always so happy when people invite us places to speak, and it happens a decent amount, but like it always just makes me feel good that folks are interested in this and want to show up for it. So thank you all. I really appreciate you. Best of luck with everything that you do.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, and I'm gonna put up our contact information. If anybody has like any questions about College Dems, I'm gonna hang around for a little bit more in case anybody wants to ask anything.